Hello guys, welcome back to my YouTube channel. From this video I am going to discuss about the osteology of radius. So you can see the whole upper limb here, and then you can see the forearm bones, that means the ulna and radius. This is radius and this is ulna. Then you have the interosseous membrane in between which connects the radius and the ulna bone. Here you can see that clearly. From my previous videos also I taught you how to start a description of a bone. First you have to determine the side of the bone, which whether the bone belongs to right side of the body or the left side of the body. So let's see to which side of the body this radius belongs. So we have to know what are the features in the upper end of the radius, then what are the features in lower end, and then what are the features belongs to medial aspect and lateral aspect of the body in this radius. In the radius, the upper end consists of a disc-shaped head. So this is the disc-shaped head. So this is the upper end of the radius. Then the lower end, it is little bit expanded. Here it is little bit expanded than the upper end, and also there is a projection downwards. This is the projection which is called as styloid process. So this is the upper end and this is the lower end. Then when we talk about the anterior surface of the lower end, we'll see anterior surface of the lower end. It forms a thick prominent ridge. Here you can see in the anterior surface of the lower end, there is a thick prominent ridge. So, this is the anterior aspect. This is the anterior aspect. Posterior surface of the lower end presents 4 grooves for extensor tendons. So, you can see in this aspect, you can see there are several grooves here. Here there are several grooves. Here, here and here. So this is the posterior aspect and this is the anterior aspect. Now you know what is the upper end, lower end, anterior aspect, posterior aspect. In the radius, the medial border is the sharpest border. We'll see what is the medial border. Here, if this is the anterior aspect, then you can see this border. This border is the medial border because this border is the sharpest border. Not only that, there is another feature in the medial aspect. That is, here you can see rough area. Here you can see the rough area and it is called as radial tuberosity, and it is also in the medial aspect. So there are two features in the medial aspect, radial tuberosity and the sharpest border of the shaft. Now you know head, it is the upper end, and then there is a styloid process, it is the lower end, and there is the sharpest border which is called as medial border medially, and also radial tuberosity medially. There is in the lower end, the thickest border is the anterior border. There are several grooves for extensor tendons in the posterior aspect of the lower end. So from these features, now you can determine the which side of the body. This is lateral. So this bone belongs to right side of the body. Like that, you have to describe the side of the bone with the features. Now we will see the features one by one. We'll see the upper end first. Here, this is the upper end, and there is a disc-shaped head, and there is a constricted area below the head. It is neck of the radius. It is neck of the radius. Then there is radial tuberosity. This head of the radius articulates with the radial notch of the ulna, forming radio-ulnar joint. That is proximal radio-ulnar joint. In this radial tuberosity, the posterior part is rough and the anterior part is smooth. You have to know that because to the rough area, the tendon of the biceps brachii is inserted. Now let's see the features in the shaft of the radius. The shaft has anterior border, posterior border and a medial border. Here this is the medial border or the interosseous border, medial border. Then this is the anterior border. And here this border. You can see this border is the posterior border. So if we draw a cross section from the shaft of the radius, it is like this. Here is the posterior border, here is the medial border, and here is the anterior border. Then you can see there are three surfaces as well. Those are, this is lateral surface, this is posterior surface, this is anterior surface. Or we can call these two surfaces as posteromedial surface and anteromedial surface. Here you can see the lateral surface, here you can see the anterior surface, and posteriorly you can see the posterior surface. When we talk about the anterior border, you can see it is somewhat oblique. Here, this anterior border is oblique in the upper half of the shaft and it is vertical in the lower half of the shaft. Anterior border starts from the lower end of the radial tuberosity and the upper half is oblique and the lower half is vertical. In the medial border, the most sharp, that means sharpest area is the middle half. Middle half is the sharpest because the interosseous membrane attached to the medial border. Interosseous membrane attached to this. Here you can see the posterior border and it is only clearly defined in the middle one third of the border. It is somewhat like rounded and you can see it divides into two and when it comes to lower end. When we talk about the lower end, there are 5 surfaces in the lower end. Here you can see the medial surface. This is the medial surface. This is the anterior surface. And then you can see the lateral surface. Then you can see the posterior surface. And here you can see the inferior surface. With this inferior surface of the radius, scaphoid and lunate bones articulates and it forms the wrist joint. inferior surface, posterior surface, then you have the lateral surface, anterior surface, and medial surface. In the medial aspect of the lower end of the radius, there is an area to articulate with the head of the ulna, and then it forms distal radio-ulnar joint. This tubercle in the lower end of the radius in the posterior aspect is called as dorsal tubercle. Here you can see the styloid process, which projects from lateral aspect of the lower end. Here you can see in this area the distal radio-ulnar joint. You can see the articulation. Here you can see the articulation with the head of the ulna, and then here is the proximal radio-ulnar joint. Here is the proximal radio-ulnar joint. Here is the distal radio-ulnar joint. Here you can see the scaphoid bone and the lunate bone. You can see how it is articulates with the lower end or inferior surface of the radius. When the wrist joint is formed, it articulates only with the radius, not with the ulnar bone. Here you can see. Here you can see the styloid process of the radius projects from lateral aspect. This is the styloid process of the ulna. Let's see muscle attachments of the radius. Here the anterior aspect of the radius. You can see the blue areas are the muscle insertions. Here you can see biceps brachii muscle inserted into the radial tuberosity. Here the supinator muscle insertion, and then the insertion of the pronator teres to the midway between the midway of the lateral aspect of the radius. Then you can see the insertion of the pronator quadratus. Then you can see the insertion of the brachioradialis muscle to the lateral aspect of the styloid process. Then the muscle origins. Here you can see the flexor digitorum superficialis radial head. Then you can see flexor pollicis longus muscle. Then here is the posterior aspect of the radius, muscle attachments, and you can see the muscle insertion, supinator muscle insertion in the posterior aspect as well. Pronator teres also you can see from the posterior aspect as well. Then here is the brachioradialis. Then extensor muscles, muscle origin, the deep layer, the abductor pollicis longus muscle here, and the extensor pollicis brevis muscle here. So those are the muscle attachments to the radius.